So
Yep.
why don't we kick off? Hi everybody, I'm Adam Shostak, and this is the second meeting of the Cyber Public Health Working Group, which is hosted by CyberGreen and Indiana University's Ostrom workshop. And today I am very excited to share with you some work that I've been doing with my co-host here at the working group, Yuri Ito, um, for Cyber Green. And I'm going to start by telling you the story. I figure I'll take about 40 minutes to work through what we've done and share it with you. We've got a tech report. I'll share the URL for that at the end, take questions, and we can talk from there. And so this really kicked off intellectually maybe a year ago as we were doing some work on what we call the Internet Infrastructure Health Measurement Framework. And one of the things that kept coming into our discussions was this question of why don't they just X? Why don't they enable DNSSEC or multi-factor authentication? And as we were doing it, we realized somewhat obviously, but we got explicit that the reason they don't do these things is a mix of the cost of doing it, the question of does it help me or someone else? And so as we were working our way through this metaphor of cyber public health, we came across a thing called the health belief model. And there'll be a larger version of that on the next screen. But the core of actually, let me tell you about the health belief model. The health belief model was created by a set of people working for the Public Health Service in the 1960s and 70s. And a paper I read recently called it one of the most influential and broadly used models in public health. And the idea is that our beliefs influence our health in a variety of ways. And there's a number of parts to this. There are the ways in which we cue people to action, the demographics of the people who are being cued. For example, last night I was at dinner with someone who was Black, and he said a lot of my family are really influenced by some of the experiments that have been done on Black people, and we're very vaccine hesitant as a result. And so these demographics come in. There's perception of threat, there's perception of costs and benefits. And overall, the health belief model enables us to think about the interventions we might want to engage in and see whether or not they will address a particular problem. And so the health belief model, and this is redrawn from a paper by a fellow named Rosenstock titled Historical Origins of the Health Belief Model. And so over on the left-hand side, there's perceived susceptibility to a disease and the perceived seriousness of a disease. Each of these influences the eventual likelihood of taking preventative action, box 6 over on the right-hand side. There's a set of modifying factors in the health belief model: demographics, socio-psychological, try saying that 3 times quickly, socio-psychological variables, which are things like personality and socioeconomic class, and then structure, societal structure, things like the knowledge of the disease and contact with. And then in the middle, there's what I found to be a very interesting box, which is simply the perceived threat of disease X. And obviously, as we think about cybersecurity, perceived threat is a word we use all the time. And then there's some cues to actions. There are things like mass media campaigns, advice from others. There's reminders from your doctor or dentist. There's the illness of a friend or family member. And each of these act as a cue to action, reminding you that this disease is something that you might want to do something about. And this all ties to the likelihood of action. And there's box number 5 in the upper right, the perceived benefits of action minus the perceived barriers. So the benefits would be that you don't get sick. But the barriers to action might be a drug has side effects, or it's hard to fit exercise into your schedule, or you live in a food desert where there are no fresh tomatoes or zucchinis available, to pull a little something from the news today. And all of this influences your likelihood of taking some recommended preventative health action. And so in this project, oh, before I say that, let me say this. And so as we were looking at this, I found what was happening around TikTok to be highly relevant. And so for the last year or more, there have been news stories about people should delete TikTok from their phones. It's a security threat. And as I read these articles, and I tried to read them in some detail out of personal curiosity, I found the descriptions of the threats both particularly vague, that they were saying the app collects a lot of personal information. Okay, how does that differ from other apps like Facebook or Twitter? What's the real difference here? And I found it hard to discover how this created more or a different threat than other apps. But there were clear costs of deleting the app, right? You can no longer get the For You feed. And so people didn't often delete it. But whatever you happen to think about TikTok, I believe that understanding the behavior that some people want to describe as risky helps us influence it. If we really believe that TikTok is a danger to its users, understanding what they get out of using it might allow us to suggest substitutes, might allow us to suggest other ways of receiving those benefits, such as using the app in your web browser instead of as a mobile app. Whatever the change might be, it's informed by a deeper understanding of the beliefs that lead people to either delete it or not. And so we created a cyber belief model based on the same belief that beliefs influence actions, or the same expectations hypothesis that beliefs influence actions. We used the same set of models, and we asked ourselves, will this help us understand and focus our attention? And so the model that we came to is actually quite similar. We did add some markings to make it easier to refer to elements of the box in a concrete way. And so we've got box 1, explicit reasons, perceived susceptibility, and perceived seriousness of the problem. We've got some psychosocial variables, and we started with the demographic variables. Who's the person? We shifted to organizational variables because a lot of defenders are enterprises or government agencies. And we modified structural variables a little bit to include weak social ties, in particular, but not limited to Twitter. The perceived threat of the problem remains entirely intact. The cues to action changes a little bit. We still have mass media campaigns and news articles, but we've added threat intelligence vendors to sort of replace doctors or dentists. And we've added the ponage of a friend, a security incident in your social network may act as a cue. Box 5 is the same. Box 6 is the same, right? The likelihood of taking preventative security action instead of preventative health action. And so with that, and I see some people dropping some comments into the chat. It's hard for me to both speak and read simultaneously and try and be cogent. So please feel encouraged to put those in, and we'll have time for discussion, and we'll pick up each of those during that time. Oops, not that, do this. So what we've done to give you some more insight into the project is we interviewed 9 people with security responsibility. Each of the interviews lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. We recorded them. They were semi-structured. We've gone ahead and coded them to say this is what people were talking about. And we had some preliminary results. We created a model. We created a coding system that we think is reasonable for this stage of the work. We've learned that the model seems illustrative and explanatory, and I'll talk about why I say that in just a second. And we learned something about the return on investment of the work people are doing. And that is the cues to action part of the model seems really saturated. There are lots and lots of cues to action in the cybersecurity world, but there are other things such as barriers and the ability to assess one's own susceptibility to a problem that are relatively limited. Oh, and I should mention that we did all of this based on the log4shell set of vulnerabilities that happened. And so we did, and so that was the sort of locus, was discussions around that. And now today we're presenting results, we're considering some follow-ons, and we've got a tech report which is available. So we created this preliminary cyber belief model, and it is intellectually important to notice or to be aware that we refined it as we interviewed rather than using precisely the same model the whole way along. We recruited 9 senior people. There were a mix of technology providers and users of that technology. And we did our best to engage in modern scientific practice, where we told people at the beginning a little bit about what we were doing. We didn't over-anchor them by telling them the full story at the start, but we did tell them that they were welcome to skip any question we might ask, or leave the interview, and just try to engage in modern scientific interview practices. And so, as I mentioned, we recorded the calls, we coded them, and what we found as we coded them, and this is the time spent in discussion, was, and what is on this graph is on the bottom, or on the x-axis, is the element of the cyber belief model. 7, 8, 9, and 10 were just coding things like us explaining the interview process, or me talking about what the cyber belief model was. And then A through I are our codes for the participant, and then how long they spent. And so you see people spent a fair amount of time, but somewhat variable, in things like the reasons for action, the factors that led them to things, time on things like the perceived threat and the cues to action that people experienced were relatively consistent. There's a lot more variability in things like the perceived benefits of action, or especially the perceived benefits. I think the ones in group 5 here who spent a lot of time talking about this were primarily talking about barriers to action. And similarly, the people talking about the likelihood of taking preventative action were explaining the factors that went into their thinking. And so, almost all of 7, 8, 9 were things like an explanation of the cyber belief model, objections to or attempts to extend it. And those took relatively little time, and that gives me a degree of confidence that the model helped us structure our thinking and also helped us find things that we otherwise would have missed. So again, low take up on things like, is there anything else? Which we asked as an explicit question. We explicitly asked people, I explicitly asked people, would you like to disagree with or challenge the model? And people said it worked for them. They brought up things like viruses and hygiene analogies. And then we got some interesting results, and I'm going to walk you through those. Those include underrated defenses. They included a lot of discussion of cues to action and also barriers to action. There was a fairly extensive discussion of susceptibility with these issues. And so the first result that I want to share is that there were a fair number of defenses, or there were really 2 defenses that came out over and over again as important for people who were successful or lacking for those who were not successful. And so the first of these was system inventory. Organizations that talked, or people that talked about their organization having a good inventory, tended to be really positive about the state of their response overall. And the people who expressed that they had a lot of difficulty talked about a failure of inventory, that they didn't know what they had, they didn't know how to find it all, and they didn't have confidence in their ability to respond. The other thing that came out was the importance of egress filtering in successful responses. And by egress filtering, what I mean is filters of unexpected outbound calls from people's data centers. And this didn't prevent the log4shell exploits from running, but it did prevent them from going out and downloading a next stage of the next stage of the exploitation software. It prevented them from connecting to command and control. It prevented exfiltration of results. And so a little bit of a screenshot from the report here. Folks mentioned this as particularly helpful. You know, participant C said, a lot of places where we saw the attempts did not have egress access enabled. You only got about halfway through the exploit chain, and then you just couldn't really complete it. And again, participant A said, once people launched their first stage, they wouldn't be able to download the payloads. And, you know, there was some technical jargon there. They only allow outbound communication from hosts that have explicitly allowed it. And when I was listening to this, some other work that I was doing caused me to be looking at a number of standards. And I don't want to criticize anyone. Writing a standard is hard, but one thing that jumped out at me was the CISA cross-sector performance goals don't mention egress filtering. NIST CSF doesn't clearly mention it. The CIS critical security controls don't explicitly talk about egress filtering, and you could perhaps read it in, but given how valuable it turned out to be and how participants effectively spontaneously started talking about why they weren't vulnerable and jumped directly to egress control, I think this is an important result. And the cyber belief model frame helped us see this in a way that previously, or with another research frame, we might not have seen it. Another thing that I want to mention is the cues to action. Almost every one of our participants mentioned Twitter. Several of them mentioned threat intelligence feeds or groups. In fact, one of our participants works for a company that sells threat intelligence. Others have their own groups, others purchase the product. There were also some positive mentions of the work that CISA did. But these cues carried a lot of challenges. There was a lot of people described it as a lot of noise, right? A lot of people said things like people were just picking up the same thing and amplifying it. And so it was hard to distinguish what was new. It was hard to figure out who'd run down which tweets, which pieces of a threat intelligence feed someone had looked at. And as this was fast moving, it was a lot of redundant work happening all at the same time. And so the cues to action really did seem saturated. And here again is another quote from the report. Someone is curating information, they acknowledge a need for delay. And what the person was really hoping for was one, urgent notification. We really believe this. But the delay in getting the dashboards done, he says, happened, quote, way after we finished. So it was not effective for us. And I believe that this is referring to the person's threat intelligence feed. And these challenges are meaningful because we spend a lot of time creating these, but they're not necessarily meeting people's needs. And again, when we start to categorize the activities we're doing, it helps us understand them. There were lots of barriers to action. Lack of system inventory, shallow inventories that didn't cover everything, that only covered, say, data centers, but not IoTs, not IoT deployments. There was some discussion of SBOM, which is an emerging standard for software bill of materials. At least one participant said SBOM as designed today wouldn't help them because there's too many things in the SBOM that aren't reachable, and so they wouldn't know whether or not they had to deal with it. Another interesting barrier to action, we had some retailers, and each of them was in a holiday freeze. If you remember, this was in the start of December 2021. And so everyone had locked down to handle the Christmas holiday season. Everyone said that after a day or so, the freezes were dissolved. They had permission to go make fixes. Another barrier to action was the stream of interrelated issues coming out at relatively high speed and all being referred to under the same rubric of log4shell. Figuring out which issue people were talking about took a lot of time and energy on the part of highly stressed and overworked defenders. And the last barrier here is a lot of organizations have oriented their responsive practices around internet-facing systems. And the inverse of that is that those organizations tend to believe that only the internet-facing systems matter, and the interior ones, things like Elasticsearch, Memcache daemons, just didn't matter, and therefore they didn't have to patch them. So here's a quote from participant E, where he says, hey, these projects you're working on, you need to kind of stop all of those and work on this for a while. And so that ended up in a series of escalations where they said, we're not worried about it. And he says, I think I explained to people why Log4j, not being internet exposed, was still vulnerable maybe 100 times, because the answer was it's in a database. It's not on the internet. We don't have to patch it. And so this belief has become entrenched in many places. And I think that the cyber belief model helps people see that these beliefs influence action. And it really started to come out when we started asking questions about what people were doing. And so again, I think it's a useful research tool. I've talked about the internet facing issue, but it fits into this idea of susceptibility. There was also this avalanche of requests, both to and from vendors. Almost everyone talked about the difficulty of getting good information to their customers or from their suppliers. One of the words that came out repeatedly in critical ways was attestation. I need you to attest that you're not vulnerable to this. Well, what is this? I'm still waiting on all of my vendors to tell me what's happening, so I can't attest to anything just yet. And is this Log4Shell as the set of issues? Is it CVE 21.44.22.8, which was the original first vuln that was publicized? Is it some set of things? Is it we don't have the vulnerable code? Is it we don't have, our systems might have the code, but it's not reachable, or we've got a filter in place? And so these dissimilar requests made it hard for everybody to coordinate and communicate about the actions they had taken. And again, the massive trade-off between completeness and correctness came up again. People's need for immediacy came up again. And I think this is another place where some norms about what sort of questions we ask one another, the timelines for those responses, and a way to communicate about assurances could be remarkably helpful in reducing the workload that defenders had to slog through. A few meta results. There were a lot of barriers to action. People made comments about the cost in terms of lost weekends, lost sleep, teams getting burned out, relationships getting stressed between security and other parts of the business. And a lot of these came in the context, and I in fact asked explicitly, did you get the support you needed from your executive teams? Pretty uniformly, the answer was, once we had briefed them, they got it and gave some pretty blank checks and open-ended support. But the iterated nature of these things really seemed to have exhausted people's resilience and preparedness. a question that I asked is, do you feel that next time you'll be better prepared? One of the answers that came back, and this was 9 months, 8 months after the incident, we're still tired from that. We're not sure how well we would deal with a second incident of that form. And overarchingly, I think the work raises an important question of, are we investing in the right things to drive action? And so we have a tech report, which is available. It's at cybergreen.net/research. And as we go from here being, we've done the work, we've produced this preliminary report, we've found interesting things that other forms of investigation may have not brought out for me. And so I think it is worth doing some investigation, some more work with the cyber belief model. It seems like a promising tool. And so, I'd love to know what you think. I would love to partner up to do more. Both, frankly, we're looking for both intellectual partners with data, partners with research capability, and funding to continue the work. We're really open to collaboration. One idea that seems exciting is to measure behavior and investments and see if we result in changes in behaviors. And this is potentially very complex, but also potentially very high impact. And a friend of mine in the public health world actually sent me this paper entitled "Why Individuals Do Not Use Contact Tracing Apps, a Health Belief Model Perspective on the German Corona War app." And in it, they built this linear regression model. And so it's not pie in the sky that someone might do this. It's something that folks in public health do, and it's something we could also do in cyber public health. And so overarchingly, I'm going to come to this slide at the end, and I'm happy to take questions that folks have. I saw that Irv left, and hi, Hurl, good to see you here. But let me pick up the questions that Irv asked while other people are conceiving of questions. So a little skepticism about making a blanket statement that this is well established in public health. Yeah. This is a model that stood out for over 50 years, right? My first citation here was to a 1974 paper by Rosenblatt. Rosenstock, excuse me. And my last citation is to a paper that came out in 2023. So that strikes me as 49 years, and Rosenblatt's paper was titled "The Origins," so it postdates the first publication or use of the model. So I think with 50 years of use, it's reasonable to think of it as a truth. And yeah, there's an argument for thinking about disease versus wellness. Absolutely. I think this is really a nice point from Irv, that a lot of what Yuri and I are thinking about as we do this work on cyber public health is, how can we develop healthy populations? And for those of you who were here last month, Dan Geer talked about one of the fundamental principles of public health being that we don't look at individual individuals with diseases, but we look at the incidence of diseases, the prevalence of diseases in a population which is related to, but not quite the same as wellness. So it's a well-made point there. And Chayapol is asking, would trying the belief model on a different level be useful? First, please give it a shot. Yeah, I'm happy to share my hypothesis, but this seems like a testable question. In an ideal world in which the organization is aligned on its priorities, perhaps not. And then the difference between theory and practice is, in theory, there's no difference. And I suspect that doing some work with a cyber belief model at the CEO level would get us some really interesting results. I think that the way in which we expect people to think about these problems and the way they express themselves are probably pretty different. Dan speaks to me as I avoid going to the doctor for certain tests and says, in the physical world, at least some of the time, the reason for not getting these tests is we don't want to know. Did we detect this explicitly? Yuri is nodding that. Are you nodding that we did, or are you nodding that it's a great question?
Nodding that I think it happens. Like some, not all the general, but I don't say this as a general speaking, but I see some in my experience to talking with the chief suite people. They sometimes don't want to know because that's a responsibility. Once you get no, you're gonna have to act. So that's maybe one factor.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through the interviews. And I think that in the case of Log4Shell, the cues to action were sufficiently intense that no one who we spoke with, and I'll come back to that in just a second, no one who we spoke with expressed that issue, but the no one who we spoke with were 9 self-selected respondents who were willing to speak to us about this. And so that may well have biased our observations, right? It's 9 is self-evidently a small number. Useful when you're doing semi-structured, useful when you're doing preliminary work, but 9 self-selected interviewees is an unusual population. And Chris Didato is saying, do care and better not to know. By the way, if people want to pop their cameras on or not and speak, you're welcome to, but I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying. Can you expand on this a little bit? I hope that is the sound of typing away. Better not to know, you'll have a liability issue. I think as a general explanation, it's entirely feasible that took place. In this particular case, with all of this, what I called an avalanche of requests to and from companies. Are you vulnerable to Log4Shell? Is the software you're shipping us vulnerable to Log4Shell? I think that people's opportunity to not answer the question was substantially smaller than it typically is because of the publicity and the cues to action. And at least one participant spoke at some length about expecting that in the future, they would see more and more such requests. And I think this also starts to tie to things like SBOM. It starts to tie to things like the recent OMB memo on software procurement, which is asking suppliers of software to the federal government, that's the phrase I wanted, asking suppliers to the federal government to attest that they've taken reasonable measures. And so I think the ability to avoid knowledge, which is absolutely a real thing. It's a motivation that I've personally experienced. I expect that will shrink, but not necessarily go away. And just reading along, I feel CISOs and CROs would love to have this knowledge. Using this to conduct their own assessments would be valuable to support security investment. Potentially, yes. One of the big themes that came out of the work is the relationship, and this exists elsewhere. It's not unique to what we just did. But the relationship between I have a component which is vulnerable, which I can find on disk, and that component is exploitable in practice. And people's beliefs about that exploitability turned out to be expensive to develop and refine. They jumped to some conclusions. They built out some conclusions, and again, one of the values of architecture was that egress filtering enabled them to reduce the need to develop this knowledge because they had evidence. All right, let's go to the next slide. You could see the attempts. And the attempts failed. They only got halfway through the chain and then couldn't complete it. And so we get to the question of what do we need to develop that knowledge, and do some of these modern architectures with egress filtering change those equations for us about what susceptibility looks like. And that goes a little bit to belief and a little bit to perceived susceptibility, and actual susceptibility obviously informs perceptions. But I don't disagree that people would like to have the knowledge. Other questions, other feedback? Well, thank you everybody for your time and attention. And we, Yuri and I, in conjunction with the Ostrom workshop at Indiana University, are actually really interested in establishing a science of cyber public health. And that involves data and metrics. It involves a societal level view. It involves starting to think about institutions and infrastructure. And so we're doing these next month. We've got Brent Frischman of Vanderbilt, who's going to talk to us, and we've got a couple of possibilities that I think are very relevant to cyber public health. He's been doing work on passwords, the influence of people's beliefs on password practices. Maybe that'll be our topic. And, you know, we are looking for future speakers. So if you've got work that you think is interesting, it can be preliminary, it can be developed. My goal here is to pull people in, get us talking about what it is we're doing, spawn some collaborations, spawn the, whatever we happen to develop organically with a little bit of pushing that takes us in this direction. And it's a very general direction. It's a very open-ended. We've got a view of where we might go, but it's not set in stone. Nobody's done this. And so I appreciate the kind words, and even more would love it for some of you to come to Yuri and myself and say, I'd like to speak about this. And it's a forum to workshop or share results or share plans. So please let us know.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you all for all that inputs and comments. I am particularly interested in how we can move forward with the quantification of this model, quantifiable. How can we build the quantifiable model and then measure each element of the vulnerabilities or weakness, systemic weakness, I should say. So, anybody has some ideas how we can actually measure, would love to hear. And hopefully we can do some interesting collaboration moving forward from here. Adam, you're on mute.
Thank you. I didn't believe I was on mute. When I think about quantification, and you and I have discussed this a little bit, but to share some of that thinking, this box of likelihood of taking recommended preventative security action is something that we can measure. And we can think about this in terms of, we invest heavily in cues to action, saying you should or you shall. But maybe the issue is perceived barriers to action or the perceived benefits. We don't need to do that. And, to pick up on the point that Chris is making in the chat, he says it's also disheartening when an SME says you should patch this and the response is that's not an issue because it's behind a firewall. If I put that into the cyber belief model, the perceived benefit of the action is low. And is the actual benefit low? Is the perception and the reality disjoint? Or do we have different perceived benefits between cybersecurity professionals and operations professionals? If we understand that better, we can do a better job at adjusting people's behavior. Similarly, we might learn that things like weak social ties which are a big deal in a lot of sociology work, weak social ties may be really important, or they may not be important. We just don't know. And so that creates an opportunity to do some research, as a research question, for example. Do people who spend time on Twitter operate more effective defenses? Are they more likely to take preventative security action? Or do they experience fewer incidents over time? So this form of quantification, this gives us a potential tool which we can study, and which I hope we do study. Looking back at them. Well, hey, I'm glad you found it all interesting. And since some folks are dropping off and saying they have to go, why don't we call this one a day and say thank you all for your time. And we'll hope to see you all next month. The fourth Thursday of the month, Yuri.
March 23rd, Thursday.
March 23rd, because it's February, and the next of these will be exactly 28 days from now. So hopefully we'll see you all back here on March 23rd. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much, Roll. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.